The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets near Buckingham Palace as 8-year-old Tommy Williams walked hand in hand with his grandmother. The elderly woman moved slowly, her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement as they made their way toward the palace gates. Tommy had been looking forward to this visit for weeks. His grandmother had promised to show him the changing of the guard, something she had done with his father 30 years ago. The streets were already bustling with tourists and locals alike. Street vendors called out their wares, selling everything, from Union Jack keychains to postcards of the royal family. The air smelled of fresh pastries from nearby cafes and the exhaust from double-decker buses that rumbled past every few minutes. Tommy's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in all the sights and sounds of royal London. As they approached the palace gates, Tommy noticed the imposing figures of the Queen's Guard standing at attention. Their red tunics were perfectly pressed, their tall bearskin hats adding to their intimidating presence. These men were not just ceremonial figures, his grandmother explained. They were real soldiers, trained and ready to protect the royal residence at all costs. Meanwhile, across the city in a luxury apartment overlooking Hyde Park, Marcus Blackwood was having a very different kind of morning. The 35-year-old investment banker was nursing a massive hangover from the previous night's corporate party. Empty champagne bottles littered his marble kitchen counter, and his designer suit from the night before lay crumpled on the Rio bedroom floor. Marcus had always lived life on his own terms. Born into wealth, he had never faced real consequences for his actions. His father's connections had gotten him out of trouble more times than he could count. Traffic violations, public disturbances, even a drunk driving incident 5 years ago. Everything had been swept under the rug with the right phone calls and generous donations to police charities. As he stumbled toward his bathroom, Marcus caught sight of himself in the mirror. His usually perfect hair was disheveled and his face showed the effects of too much alcohol and too little sleep. He had an important client meeting in 2 hours, but first, he needed coffee and lots of it. The pounding in his head made every sound feel like a hammer blow. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant reminding him about the meeting and asking if he needed anything rescheduled. Marcus ignored them all. He had built his reputation on being unpredictable, on playing by his own rules. His clients seemed to respect that about him, or at least they respected the returns he generated on their investments. After a quick shower and several cups of strong espresso, Marcus felt somewhat human again. He chose his most expensive suit, a custom-tailored piece from Savile Row that cost more than most people earned in 3 months. Image was everything in his world, and he never left his apartment looking anything less than perfect. As he made his way to the underground parking garage, Marcus decided to take his Lamborghini instead of calling for his usual driver. The bright, yellow sports car was his pride and joy, a symbol of his success and his refusal to blend in with the ordinary world around him. The engine roared to life, sending vibrations through the concrete structure and earning disapproving looks from his more conservative neighbors. Back near the palace, Tommy and his grandmother had found a perfect spot to watch the ceremony. The elderly woman had brought a small folding chair, knowing that standing for long periods was becoming increasingly difficult for her. Tommy sat cross-legged on the pavement beside her, his school backpack forgotten as he watched the guards march, in perfect formation. The crowd around them was diverse and cheerful. Families with young children pointed excitedly at the guards, while elderly couples reminisced about previous visits. Tour groups followed their guides, who spoke in various languages about the history and traditions they were witnessing. Street musicians played nearby, their melodies mixing with the sounds of the city. Tommy's grandmother began telling him stories about the palace and the royal family. She spoke of kings and queens, of ceremonies and traditions that stretched back hundreds of years. Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had witnessed decades of history, who had seen the city change and evolve, while the palace remained a constant symbol of stability. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger. More tourists arrived. More families sought out the perfect viewing spot. The atmosphere was festive and peaceful, exactly the kind of scene that made London famous around the world. Police officers on foot patrol smiled and chatted with visitors, while mounted officers on beautiful horses added to the royal atmosphere. Marcus, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated with the London traffic. His meeting was in the financial district, but construction work had closed several major roads. His GPS kept recalculating the route, adding precious minutes to his journey. The hangover was making him irritable, and the stop-and-go traffic was testing his limited patience. He found himself taking side streets he rarely used, trying to find a faster route through the maze of London's ancient road system. The narrow streets were crowded with pedestrians, delivery trucks, and other vehicles all competing for space. His expensive car drew stares and comments from people on the sidewalks, some admiring, others clearly disapproving of such an ostentatious display of wealth. As he approached the area near Buckingham Palace, Marcus could see the crowds gathering for the ceremony. In his current mood, the sight of so many people enjoying themselves only irritated him further. He had never understood the fascination with the royal family or their traditions. To him, it was all an outdated spectacle that served no real purpose in the modern world. The traffic light ahead turned red, forcing him to stop just as his phone rang. It was his most important client, calling to confirm the details of their meeting. As Marcus reached for his phone, he failed to notice that the light had turned green or that pedestrians were beginning to cross the street in front of him. The stage was set for a collision that would change everything. The collision happened in what felt like slow motion. Marcus, distracted by his phone call and still suffering from his hangover, pressed the accelerator just as Tommy stepped into the crosswalk with his grandmother. The yellow Lamborghini struck, the boy with a sickening thud, sending his small body flying several feet before he hit the pavement with a terrible impact. Time seemed to stop. The cheerful sounds of the morning, the chatter of tourists, the clip-clop of horses, the distant music, all faded into an eerie silence that lasted for perhaps 3 seconds. Then chaos erupted. Tommy's grandmother screamed, a sound so filled with anguish that it seemed to pierce the very air. She dropped her cane and fell to her knees beside her grandson, her hands shaking as she tried to assess his injuries. Blood was seeping from a gash on his forehead, and his left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. His school backpack had burst open, scattering his books and pencils across the wet pavement. Within moments, people began rushing toward the scene from all directions. A nurse who had been among the tourists immediately knelt beside Tommy, checking his pulse and trying to keep him conscious. Someone called for an ambulance while others formed a protective circle around the injured boy, shielding him from the growing crowd of onlookers. Marcus sat frozen in his car for several seconds, his phone still pressed to his ear. His client's voice seemed to come from very far away, asking what was wrong, why Marcus had suddenly gone silent. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in slowly, like cold water seeping through his consciousness. He ended the call abruptly and stepped out of his car. His legs felt unsteady, whether from the hangover or the shock he couldn't tell. The first thing he noticed was how quiet the crowd had become. Hundreds of eyes were now fixed on him, and the expressions on people's faces ranged from shock to disgust to outright anger. "You hit a child," someone shouted from the crowd. "How could you not see him?" Marcus tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. He had been in difficult situations before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a business deal gone wrong or a regulatory investigation. This was a hurt child, bleeding on the pavement, and he was responsible. The sound of sirens began to fill the air, growing louder as emergency vehicles navigated through the crowded streets. A police car arrived first, followed quickly by an ambulance. The paramedics immediately took over from the helpful nurse, working quickly to stabilize Tommy before transporting him to the hospital. As the medical team worked, police officers began securing the scene and taking statements from witnesses. There were dozens of people who had seen what happened, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. The driver had been distracted, possibly on his phone. He had accelerated through a crosswalk when pedestrians had the right of way. The boy had been walking normally with his elderly grandmother when he was struck. One witness, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson, was particularly articulate in her description of events. She had been standing just 20 feet away when the accident occurred and had seen everything clearly. "That man was on his phone," she told the police officer firmly. "He wasn't paying attention at all. That poor little boy didn't have a chance to get out of the way. The police officers approached Marcus, who was now standing beside his damaged car. The front bumper was cracked, and there was a small dent in the hood where Tommy's body had made contact. One of the officers, Sergeant Williams, was a 20-year veteran who had seen his share of traffic accidents. He could tell immediately that this was a case of dangerous driving, possibly while under the influence. "Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle," Sergeant Williams said firmly. "I can smell alcohol on your breath. Have you been drinking this morning?" Marcus shook his head, though he knew his breath probably still carried traces of the previous night's champagne. "No, officer. I had some drinks last night, but that was hours ago. I'm fine to drive." The sergeant was not convinced. He had Marcus perform several field sobriety tests, which the banker barely passed. While his blood alcohol level might have been below the legal limit, it was clear that he was still impaired from the previous night's drinking. More importantly, multiple witnesses had seen him using his phone while driving. As Tommy was being loaded into the ambulance, his grandmother climbed in beside him. Her face was pale with shock and streaked with tears. She kept whispering prayers under her breath, her gnarled hands clutching a small cross necklace. The paramedics assured her that they were taking Tommy to the best children's hospital in London, but her fear was palpable. The crowd that had gathered was growing increasingly angry. Word of what had happened was spreading quickly through the area, and more people were arriving to see what the commotion was about. Many of them were families with young children who had come to enjoy the morning's ceremonies. Seeing Tommy's broken body being wheeled away on a stretcher struck a nerve with every parent present. "Lock him up," someone shouted from the crowd. "He could have killed that boy." "Typical rich boy thinks he owns the streets," called out another voice. The police officers were working to keep the crowd back, but the mood was becoming increasingly hostile. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing storm of public anger, something his wealth and connections had always protected him from before. Standing nearby, unnoticed by most of the crowd, were two members of the Queen's Guard who had been on their way to their posts. Corporal James Mitchell and Lance Corporal David Thompson had witnessed the entire incident from about 50 yards away. As trained soldiers, they were accustomed to maintaining their composure in stressful situations, but seeing a child deliberately struck by a careless driver had shaken them both. The Queen's Guard took their duty to protect very seriously, and that duty extended beyond just the royal family to all citizens, especially the most vulnerable. Both soldiers had children of their own, and watching Tommy's small body hit the pavement had awakened something fierce and protective in them. They had already given their statements to the police, providing clear, detailed accounts of what they had observed. But as they watched Marcus being questioned, they noticed something that troubled them deeply. The man showed no real remorse, no genuine concern for the child he had injured. His primary worry seemed to be about the damage to his expensive car and how this incident might affect his business meeting. At St. Mary's Children's Hospital, Tommy was rushed into the emergency department where a team of doctors and nurses immediately began working to save his life. The boy had suffered a severe concussion, a broken leg, and internal bleeding that required immediate surgery. His grandmother sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly together as she prayed for her grandson's recovery. Dr. Sarah Collins, the head of pediatric trauma, had seen countless cases of children injured in traffic accidents. Each one affected her deeply, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about this case. Tommy was the same age as her own son, and the circumstances of the accident, a wealthy man in an expensive car striking a child because he was distracted by his phone, filled her with quiet rage. As the medical team worked to stabilize Tommy, news of the accident began to spread beyond the immediate area. Social media posts from witnesses started appearing online, complete with photos of the damaged Lamborghini and descriptions of what had happened. The story was picked up by local news outlets within hours, and by evening, it had become a national news story. The headlines were damning. Wealthy banker strikes child near palace while on phone, and investment banker's reckless driving leaves boy fighting for life. The contrast between Marcus's obvious wealth and Tommy's working-class background made the story even more compelling to the public. This wasn't just a traffic accident. It was a symbol of everything wrong with society's inequalities. Meanwhile, Marcus had been released on bail after being charged with dangerous driving and driving while impaired. His expensive lawyer, Jeremy Blackstone from one of London's most prestigious law firms, had arrived within 2 hours of the accident. Blackstone was known for getting wealthy clients out of serious legal trouble, and he immediately began working to minimize the charges against Marcus. "We'll argue that it was an unfortunate accident," Blackstone told Marcus, as they sat in his office that evening.
"Yes, you were distracted, but who hasn't checked their phone while driving? We'll get character witnesses, emphasize your charitable contributions, and work on a plea bargain. You might lose your license for a while, but we can keep you out."
Of prison. But Marcus wasn't thinking about prison. He was thinking about his reputation, his business, and how this incident might affect his carefully constructed image. He had worked hard to build his brand as a successful, untouchable investment banker. Now that image was crumbling, and he could feel his world beginning to collapse around him. The media attention was relentless. Reporters had discovered his address and were camping outside his apartment building. His photograph was being broadcast on every news channel, and social media was filled with calls for justice. Some people were even calling for boycotts of his investment firm, which managed billions in assets for wealthy clients. His father, Lord Blackwood, called that evening. The elderly man's voice was cold and disappointed. "Marcus, this is a disaster. The family name is being dragged through the mud. I've spent my entire life building our reputation, and you've destroyed it in a single morning." "It was an accident, Father," Marcus protested. "These things happen." "No, Marcus. Accidents happen to careful people who make honest mistakes. This happened because you're irresponsible and selfish. I'm cutting off your trust fund until this is resolved. Maybe facing real consequences for once will teach you something about responsibility." The conversation ended with his father hanging up, leaving Marcus alone in his expensive apartment that suddenly felt like a prison. For the first time in his life, his family's money and influence might not be enough to save him. Back at the hospital, Corporal Mitchell and Lance Corporal Thompson had arrived to check on Tommy's condition. It wasn't official business. The Queen's Guard had no formal role in civilian matters. But both men felt compelled to ensure the boy was receiving proper care. They had changed out of their ceremonial uniforms and were dressed in civilian clothes, but their military bearing was unmistakable. They spoke with Dr. Collins, who updated them on Tommy's condition. The surgery had been successful in stopping the internal bleeding, but the boy remained in critical condition. His brain injury was severe, and the next 24 hours would be crucial in determining his long-term prognosis. "He's a fighter," Dr. Collins told them, "but he's going to need all the support he can get. His grandmother is his only family, and she's elderly and frightened." The two soldiers spent some time with Tommy's grandmother, Mrs. Williams, offering what comfort they could. She was a proud woman who had raised her grandson alone since his parents died in a car crash when he was 3 years old. Now, facing the possibility of losing him too, she seemed fragile and lost. "He's such a good boy," she whispered to the soldiers. "Never gets in trouble, always helps me with the shopping. He was so excited about seeing the palace today. It was supposed to be a special day for us." Corporal Mitchell, whose own son was just a year younger than Tommy, felt something harden inside him. This wasn't just about a traffic accident anymore. This was about justice, about protecting the innocent, and about holding people accountable for their actions regardless of their wealth or status. As the two soldiers left the hospital that evening, they began discussing what they had witnessed and learned. They had both served in Afghanistan and had seen the devastating effects of violence on innocent civilians. The sight of Tommy lying broken on the pavement had awakened the same protective instincts that had made them good soldiers overseas. "That man showed no remorse?" Lance Corporal Thompson said quietly as they walked through the hospital parking lot. "I watched him the entire time the police were questioning him. He was more concerned about his car than about the boy he nearly killed." Corporal Mitchell nodded grimly. "Men like him think they're above consequences. They think money and connections can buy them out of any situation." "Maybe they can," Thompson replied, His lawyer is already talking about plea bargains and character witnesses. I've seen it before. Rich man hurts poor child, pays some money, and walks away to hurt someone else. The two men walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. They had sworn an oath to protect and serve not just the royal family but the realm and its people. That oath didn't end when they removed their ceremonial uniforms. By the time they reached their quarters that night, both men had come to the same conclusion. If the legal system failed Tommy and his grandmother, if Marcus Blackwood's money and connections allowed him to escape real justice, then perhaps it was time for a different kind of accountability. The Queen's Guard had been protecting the realm for centuries, and sometimes protection required more than just standing at attention in red tunics and tall hats. 3 weeks after the accident, Tommy Williams finally opened his eyes. The moment came just after dawn, when the hospital ward was quiet except for the gentle beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of night nurses completing their rounds. His grandmother, who had barely left his bedside, was dozing in an uncomfortable chair when she heard him whisper her name. Nan? Tommy's voice was barely audible, but it was the most beautiful sound Mrs. Williams had ever heard. Tears streamed down the elderly woman's face as she gently took his small hand in hers. I'm here, love. I'm right here. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about Tommy's recovery. The brain injury had been severe, but there were no signs of permanent damage. His broken leg was healing well, though he would need months of physical therapy to walk normally again. The internal injuries had healed completely, leaving only surgical scars that would fade with time. Dr. Collins found herself deeply moved by the reunion between grandmother and grandson. In her 15 years of pediatric medicine, she had seen many miracles, but few had affected her as profoundly as watching Tommy's eyes focus on his grandmother's face with perfect recognition and love. The news of Tommy's awakening spread quickly through the hospital staff and beyond. Corporal Mitchell and Lance Corporal Thompson, who had been visiting regularly in their civilian clothes, were among the first to hear. Both men felt a profound sense of relief, though their anger toward Marcus Blackwood remained as strong as ever. During Tommy's 3 weeks in a coma, the case had continued to develop in ways that frustrated everyone seeking justice. Marcus's expensive legal team had been working around the clock to minimize the charges. They had successfully argued that the blood alcohol test taken hours after the accident was inconclusive, and they were challenging the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen Marcus using his phone while driving. Jeremy Blackstone was considered one of the finest criminal defense attorneys in England, and he earned his reputation by finding loopholes and technicalities that others missed. He had already gotten several key pieces of evidence thrown out on procedural grounds, and he was confident that he could negotiate a plea deal that would keep Marcus out of prison. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Margaret Foster, was a dedicated public servant who had spent 20 years fighting for justice on behalf of ordinary citizens. She was disgusted by the obvious attempts to buy Marcus's way out of accountability, but she was also realistic about the challenges she faced in court. These people have unlimited resources, she explained to Tommy's grandmother during one of their meetings. They can hire the best lawyers, the best expert witnesses, and they can drag this case out for years if necessary. Meanwhile, we have a limited budget and a heavy caseload. Mrs. Williams listened with growing despair. She had always believed that the law was fair, that justice would prevail regardless of someone's wealth or social status. Now she was learning that the legal system was just another arena where money could buy favorable outcomes. The media attention, which had been intense immediately after the accident, was beginning to fade. News stories were capturing public attention, and Marcus Blackwood was slowly disappearing from the headlines. His public relations team had begun a careful campaign to rehabilitate his image, emphasizing his charitable work and his contributions to the local community. Marcus himself had been laying low, avoiding public appearances and conducting his business from his apartment. His clients had been surprisingly understanding, viewing his legal troubles as a temporary setback rather than a serious character flaw. In their world, such incidents were seen as unfortunate, but not necessarily disqualifying. He had even begun to convince himself that he was the real victim in this situation. After all, it had been an accident. He hadn't intended to hurt anyone. The boy had recovered, so what was the point of ruining his life over one moment of inattention? These kinds of rational thoughts helped him sleep at night and maintain his sense of innocence. But Corporal Mitchell and Lance Corporal Thompson were not willing to let the matter rest. They had been quietly conducting their own investigation, using skills learned during their military service to gather information that the police might have missed. They had interviewed additional witnesses, studied traffic camera footage, and built a detailed timeline of Marcus's activities in the days leading up to the accident. What they discovered only strengthened their resolve. Marcus had a pattern of reckless behavior that went back years. They found evidence of previous incidents that had been covered up or settled quietly out of court. There was the time he had driven through a red light and struck another vehicle, resulting in serious injuries to an elderly couple. His father's lawyers had negotiated a settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement, keeping the incident out of the public record. There was also the night he had been arrested for drunk driving 5 years earlier. The charges had mysteriously disappeared after his family made a substantial donation to a police charity. The arresting officer had been transferred to another department shortly afterward, and the case file had been sealed. The two soldiers began to realize that Tommy's accident was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that had been enabled by wealth and privilege. Marcus Blackwood was a danger to the public, and the legal system seemed incapable of stopping him. They also learned more about Tommy's family situation. Mrs. Williams was living on a small pension, barely able to afford the expenses associated with her grandson's medical care. While the National Health Service was covering most of the treatment costs, there were numerous additional expenses that were creating financial hardship for the elderly woman. Meanwhile, Marcus was spending thousands of pounds on legal fees without any apparent concern for the financial burden he had placed on his victim's family. He had not offered to pay for Tommy's medical expenses or to provide any form of compensation beyond what might be required by law. During one of their visits to the hospital, the two soldiers witnessed a particularly heartbreaking scene. Tommy, who was finally strong enough to sit up in bed, was trying to draw a picture with crayons that a nurse had brought him. His left hand, which had been injured in the accident, shook as he attempted to color within the lines. "I can't make my hand work right, Nan," he said with frustration. "Why won't it work like it used to?" Mrs. Williams gently guided his hand, helping him complete the drawing. "It just needs time to get better, love. The doctors say you'll be able to draw properly again soon." But both soldiers could see the fear in the elderly woman's eyes. The doctors had been honest with her about Tommy's prognosis. While they expected him to make a full recovery, there might be some long-term effects from his injuries. His coordination might never be quite the same, and there was a small possibility of lasting cognitive difficulties. As they watched the brave little boy struggling with his crayons, both Mitchell and Thompson felt their anger crystallize into something harder and more focused. This child's life had been forever changed by the careless actions of a wealthy man who seemed to feel no genuine remorse for what he had done. That night, as they sat in their quarters discussing what they had witnessed, the two soldiers began to formulate a plan. If the legal system could not deliver justice for Tommy and his grandmother, then perhaps it was time to consider alternative forms of accountability. 6 months after the accident, the trial of Marcus Blackwood began at the Old Bailey. The prosecution, led by Margaret Foster, presented a strong case built on witness testimony, traffic camera footage, and expert analysis of the accident scene. They painted a picture of a wealthy, careless man who had shown complete disregard for the safety of others. The defense team, headed by Jeremy Blackstone, mounted an aggressive counterattack. They questioned the reliability of witness testimony, challenged the technical evidence, and presented Marcus as a successful businessman who had made an unfortunate mistake that could happen to anyone. They brought in character witnesses who testified to his charitable work and his contributions to society. Throughout the trial, Marcus maintained his composure, dressed in expensive suits and projecting an image of respectability. His family sat behind him in the gallery, presenting a united front of upper-class solidarity. Occasionally he would glance across the courtroom at Tommy and his grandmother, but his expression remained neutral. almost detached. Tommy, now walking with the aid of a cane, attended the trial whenever his health permitted. The months of recovery had been difficult, filled with painful physical therapy sessions and frustrating setbacks. His left hand still trembled sometimes, making it difficult to write or draw. The bright, cheerful boy who had been excited about seeing the palace had been replaced by a quieter, more cautious child who startled at loud noises and refused to cross busy streets. Mrs. Williams watched the proceedings with growing despair. She could see that the defense attorneys were succeeding in their strategy of creating doubt and minimizing Marcus's culpability. The jury, composed primarily of middle-class citizens, seemed impressed by the parade of character witnesses and the technical arguments about accident reconstruction. On the fourth day of the trial, something unexpected happened. As Marcus was leaving the courthouse during a lunch break, he was approached by a group of reporters. One of them asked if he had any message for Tommy and his family. Marcus paused for a moment, clearly annoyed by the question. Then, in a moment of unguarded honesty, he revealed his true feelings about the situation. "Look, it was an accident," he said impatiently. "These things happen in a busy city. I'm sorry the boy was hurt, but I can't be held responsible for every pedestrian who doesn't pay attention to traffic. I have my own life to worry about." The callous remarks were captured on camera and broadcast that evening on every major news channel. The public reaction was swift and furious. Social media exploded with outrage, and protesters gathered outside the courthouse the next morning, demanding justice for Tommy. Corporal Mitchell and Lance Corporal Thompson watched the news coverage from their quarters that evening. Both men had been following the trial closely, and they were not surprised by Marcus's revealing comments. They had seen his true character on the day of the accident, when he had shown more concern for his damaged car than for the injured child. "He's going to walk away from this," Mitchell said quietly. "His lawyers will apologize for his comments, claim he was under stress, and the jury will give him the benefit of the doubt." Thompson nodded grimly. "Rich people always have a way of turning themselves into the victim. By the time this is over, they'll have convinced everyone that he's the one who suffered the most." The two soldiers had been meeting regularly over the past months, discussing the case and sharing their growing frustration with the legal system's inability to deliver real justice. They had both served their country with honor, risking their lives to protect others. Now they were witnessing a system that seemed designed to protect the wealthy and powerful, while abandoning the vulnerable. Their military training had taught them that sometimes direct action was necessary when institutional systems failed. In Afghanistan, they had seen corrupt officials escape justice while innocent civilians suffered. The parallels to Tommy's case were striking and deeply troubling. "We swore an oath," Mitchell said, referring to their commitment as members of the Queen's Guard. "We promised to protect the realm and its people. That oath doesn't come with exceptions for rich criminals." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what his colleague was suggesting. They both knew that taking action outside the legal system would end their military careers and potentially land them in prison. But they also knew that they would have to live with themselves if they allowed Marcus Blackwood to escape accountability for his actions. "What are you thinking?" Thompson asked finally. Mitchell outlined a plan that had been forming in his mind for weeks. It was not violent. Both men were adamantly opposed to causing physical harm. But it would send a clear message that some actions had consequences regardless of wealth or status. The plan involved using their knowledge of London's security systems and their access to certain areas of the city to orchestrate a public confrontation that would force Marcus to face the full weight of public judgment. They would use their military skills and resources to ensure that he could not hide behind lawyers and public relations teams. "It's risky," Mitchell admitted. "If we're caught, we'll lose everything. Our careers, our pensions, possibly our freedom." Thompson thought about his own children, about the kind of world he wanted them to grow up in. "If we don't do something, men like Marcus Blackwood will keep hurting people and getting away with it. Someone has to draw a line." Over the following weeks, as the trial continued and it became increasingly clear that Marcus would likely receive only a minor sentence, the two soldiers refined their plan. They studied Marcus's routine, identified his vulnerabilities, and prepared for an operation that would require all of their military training and experience. They also spent time with Tommy and his grandmother, offering support and encouragement during the difficult trial period. They watched the brave little boy struggle with his recovery, seeing how the accident had changed not just his physical capabilities but his entire outlook on life. The contrast between Tommy's courage and Marcus's callous indifference only strengthened their resolve. This was not about revenge. It was about justice and accountability. It was about ensuring that wealth and privilege could not always shield people from the consequences of their actions. As the trial entered its final phase, both soldiers knew that their moment of decision was approaching. Soon they would have to choose between their comfortable careers and their deeper commitment to justice. The choice, when it came, was easier than either of them had expected. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon in late autumn. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Marcus Blackwood guilty of dangerous driving but acquitted him of the more serious charges. The sentence was 18 months in prison, suspended, 2 years of probation, and a fine of £50,000, a sum that Marcus could pay without any real financial hardship. As Marcus left the courthouse that day, smiling and shaking hands with his legal team, Tommy sat in his wheelchair in the gallery, tears streaming down his face. His grandmother held him close, whispering words of comfort, but both of them knew that justice had not been served. 3 months after the trial ended, Marcus Blackwood had returned to his normal life with remarkable ease. His suspended sentence meant he had never spent a single day in prison. The probation requirements were minimal, monthly check-ins with an officer who seemed more interested in discussing investment strategies than monitoring his compliance. The fine had been paid immediately, barely making a dent in his substantial wealth. His business had not only survived the scandal, but had actually grown during his legal troubles. Some clients seemed to view his ability to navigate the legal system as evidence of his resourcefulness and connections. His father had even restored his trust fund, impressed by how well Marcus had handled what he called a challenging situation. Marcus had hired a new public relations firm that was slowly rebuilding his image. They arranged for carefully orchestrated charity appearances and media interviews where he expressed deep regret about the unfortunate incident. His lawyers had coached him on the exact words to use, expressing regret without admitting legal liability, showing concern without accepting responsibility. The media had largely moved on to other stories. Tommy Williams and his grandmother had faded from public consciousness, becoming just another footnote in London's endless stream of news. Marcus felt vindicated in his belief that money and patience could overcome any obstacle, even public outrage, on Deo. A cold Tuesday morning in February, Marcus was preparing for an important client presentation when his doorman called to inform him that 2 men were waiting to see him in the lobby. They claimed to be from a security consulting firm and said they had important information about potential threats to his safety. Marcus was intrigued rather than concerned. His newfound notoriety had brought a few threatening letters and angry phone calls, but nothing serious enough to worry about. He had been considering hiring personal security anyway, viewing it as another symbol of his success and importance. The 2 men who entered his apartment were professionally dressed and carried themselves with military bearing. They introduced themselves as security consultants, but there was something familiar about them that Marcus couldn't quite place. One was tall and broad-shouldered with piercing blue eyes, while the other was slightly shorter but equally intimidating. "Mr. Blackwood," the taller man said, "we understand you've been receiving some threatening communications since your trial. We specialize in personal protection for high-profile individuals." Marcus invited them to sit down, pouring himself a coffee while they talked. He was always interested in services that might enhance his status or security. "What kind of threats are we talking about? I've had some angry letters, but nothing too serious." The shorter man opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder. "We've been monitoring social media and online forums. There's been some concerning chatter about your case. People who feel that justice wasn't served, who might be planning to take matters into their own hands." As Marcus leaned forward to examine the documents they had brought, something clicked in his memory. These men had, been at the scene of the accident. He remembered seeing them in the crowd, though they had been wearing different clothes then. "You're soldiers," he said suddenly, his voice taking on a suspicious tone. "You were there that day, weren't you? At the accident?" Corporal Mitchell and Lance Corporal Thompson exchanged a quick glance. Their plan had always included the possibility that Marcus might recognize them eventually. "Yes," Mitchell said calmly. "We were members of the Queen's Guard on duty that morning. We witnessed what you did to that little boy." Marcus stood up quickly, reaching for his phone. "Get out of my apartment. This is harassment. I'll call the police." Thompson moved with military precision, intercepting Marcus before he could reach his phone. "I don't think you want to call the police, Mr. Blackwood, not yet. Not until you hear what we have to say." For the first time since the accident, Marcus felt genuinely afraid. These weren't lawyers or reporters or angry citizens posting on social media. These were trained soldiers who had clearly planned this confrontation carefully. Mitchell pulled out a tablet and began showing Marcus a series of photographs and documents. "We've been doing some research into your background. Very interesting reading. That drunk driving incident 5 years ago that mysteriously disappeared. The hit and run that was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement. The pattern of reckless behavior that your family's money has been covering up for years." Marcus's face went pale as he saw evidence of incidents he thought had been buried forever. "How did you get these? These records are sealed." "We have certain skills," Thompson said quietly. "Military training has its advantages when it comes to gathering information. The question is, what do you think would happen if these records became public? How would your clients react if they knew the full extent of your criminal history?" Marcus sank back into his chair, his mind racing. His business depended on trust and reputation. If his clients learned that he had been involved in multiple serious incidents that had been covered up, it would destroy everything he had built. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell sat down across from him, his expression serious but not threatening. "We want justice, Mr. Blackwood. Real justice, not the mockery that passed for a trial. Tommy Williams is still struggling with the injuries you caused. His grandmother is working 2 jobs to pay for his ongoing medical care while you've been celebrating your escape from accountability." "I was sentenced according to the law," Marcus protested weakly. "The law failed," Thompson said firmly. "It failed because you had expensive lawyers and political connections while Tommy had an elderly grandmother and a court-appointed advocate. The system is rigged in favor of people like you, and we've decided that needs to change." Mitchell leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to make this right. You're going to pay for Tommy's medical care, his education, and his future needs. You're going to establish a trust fund that will ensure he and his grandmother never have to worry about money again." "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Thompson smiled grimly. "Then these documents become public. Your criminal history gets exposed. Your business collapses. Your reputation is destroyed permanently. And that's just the beginning." Marcus looked at the 2 soldiers, realizing that he was facing men who were not impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his connections. They had risked their own careers and freedom to be here, and they were clearly prepared to follow through on their threats. "How much?" he asked finally. £5 million, Mitchell said without hesitation, "placed in a trust fund for Tommy's care and education, plus an additional $1 million for his grandmother's living expenses. And you're going to do it publicly, with a full apology for your actions and acceptance of responsibility." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. £6 million was a significant sum even for him, but more than the money, the public admission of guilt would be devastating to his carefully reconstructed reputation. "You're asking me to destroy my own life," he said desperately. "No," Thompson replied. "We're asking you to take responsibility for what you did. You destroyed a little boy's life and walked away without consequences. Now it's time to pay for your actions." The 2 soldiers stood up, leaving the folder of documents on Marcus's coffee table. "You have 48 hours to decide," Mitchell said. "Either you do the right thing voluntarily, or we make the decision for you." As they reached the door, Thompson turned back. "One more thing, Mr. Blackwood. If you think about running or trying to use your connections to make this go away, remember that we know how to find people. We've spent years protecting others from men like you. We won't hesitate to finish what we started." After they left, Marcus sat alone in his expensive apartment, staring at the documents that could destroy everything he had worked to build. For the first time in his privileged life, he was facing consequences that money alone could not buy his way out of. 2 days later, Marcus Blackwood held a press conference outside the same hospital where Tommy Williams was still receiving treatment. With cameras rolling and reporters watching, he announced the establishment of a £6 million trust fund for Tommy's care, and formally apologized for his actions on that terrible morning near Buckingham Palace. The two members of the Queen's Guard watched the press conference from their quarters, knowing that their military careers were likely over but feeling a deep satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Sometimes, they reflected, protecting the realm required more than just standing guard at palace gates. Sometimes it required ordinary soldiers to step forward and ensure that the powerful could not escape the consequences of their actions. Tommy Williams, now walking without his cane and slowly regaining the use of his left hand, watched the press conference with his grandmother. For the first time since the accident, the elderly woman allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be okay. Justice had come in an unexpected form, but it had come nonetheless. And sometimes that was enough.